Hello and welcome to the CivilTalk Podcast. I'm your host, Tapasi Althouse. If you're new to the show, this is where we explore civility and social emotional learning with esteemed guests, expert insights, and practical advice to help people navigate the world. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Michael Horn, a leading voice in the future of education, innovation, and how we prepare learners for a rapidly changing world. Michael is the co-author of Disrupting Class, How Disruptive Innovation Will Change the Way the World Learns, blended using disruptive innovation to improve schools and choosing college. And he writes and speaks extensively about the transformation of learning systems to better meet the needs of all students. He's also the co-founder of the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation and currently serves as a senior strategist at Guild Education, helping working adults access affordable education pathways, and he currently teaches at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. His work has shaped conversations around student agency, technology, and education, and the critical role of mindset and emotional skills in lifelong learning. On today's episode, we'll explore how emotional intelligence, civility, and innovation can coexist to create more equitable, human-centered learning experiences. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to have exactly this conversation because it's the conversation we need to be having right now in our society. So thank you for having a podcast all around these topics.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for being a critical thought leader on this. We really need people like you. So we're happy to have you and honored. So with that, you've spent years, from your background, rethinking how education should work. What, just for our listeners, what originally drew you to this intersection of innovation and learning?
Yeah, well, so the honest answer, right, is that I was a student at business school at Harvard, taking Clay Christensen's class, who's the father of disruptive innovation theory.
Mm-hmm.
And he had been wondering about how his theories of innovation could contribute to solving thorny problems in social sector areas for a while, education being top of his list. And he had this opportunity to co-author a book with him, which became Disrupting Class. And so I sort of jumped at the opportunity. I think the other part of the answer, right, to your question is, it seemed to me that our schools were in desperate need of innovation to unlock human potential. And the ideas that Clay had developed over his career around how to help organizations manage innovation seemed to me something that could be really useful to schools as they try to navigate these currents and sort of modernize for the current age.
Yeah. So with that, you co-founded the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation, which also sounds just very punk rock. I love it so much. To bring theory into real world practice. Can you just talk to us a little bit about what that is for our listeners and what was the original vision for the Institute and how that has sort of evolved since its founding?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny to hear it described as punk rock because I wish it was sometimes a little bit more edgy, but it's essentially a think tank, right? And what we do is careful research using the theories into a variety of areas. We started with education and healthcare, and the idea was to basically get on the ground, understand real solutions that could be bubbled up, give real tools and techniques to entrepreneurs, innovators, educators in our case, and policymakers as well, to help them steer through. When I was there full-time, which stopped in 2015, so 10 years ago, we were focused largely on education and healthcare. But, it was K-12 education when I was there, and then we were moving up into higher education. And now I spend a day a week still with the Institute, and I'm chair of the board still. We have a global prosperity practice with Ifosa Ojomo, who's working a lot on, sort of eliminating poverty is the wrong question. How do we actually create prosperity for individuals and reframing around that? Or Julia Freeland Fisher does a ton of work about the importance of social capital in people's lives. And yes, that has clear implications in K-12, but it also has implications for college. And frankly, with AI, and AI companions starting to emerge, it has huge implications across all parts of society. So we sort of branch into these sticky thickets, if you will, of questions where people seem to be deadlocked. And our hypothesis anyway, is that through innovation, you can break some of these trade-offs to allow people who might not see eye to eye to make progress together.
Yeah. Yeah, really focusing, like, solution oriented, and focusing on that. One of the Institute's core principles is that disruption can be used for social good. How do you think that principle plays out most powerfully in education today?
Yeah. So look, for your listeners, I'll just say, like, disruption as we define it, is basically the process of taking sectors where things are deeply centralized, inaccessible, complicated, only available to people who have the expertise or wealth to use them, and decentralizes that. So far more individuals have access to things that are more affordable, convenient, accessible, simple, and so forth. And what I would say in education, right? You think about tutoring, for example. We know that tutoring is the best way to learn. Small group, conversations, those idyllic Socratic seminars that you might imagine. We also know most individuals do not have access to that. And through the use of technology, though, you can start to create more personalized environments for kids. You can actually allow them to move at the path and pace that makes sense for them. You can create social experiences, right, where you're grouping kids who are working at different levels or working at similar levels, depending on your objective, into projects and communities and questions and conversations to really explore ideas. And so that's really the question, right? Is almost like, how do we create a tutor for every child with at a cost that we can actually afford, and in a way that will really intrinsically motivate them to be excited about what they're learning and the progress that they can make.
Yeah. I also love that you just use, again, the word disruptive, because you guys use it in a very specific way. And instead of using something like equitable, it really is disrupting the powers that be. And
Yeah.
it's a really strong word that you're magnetized to that word, because you want to change something in your life. You want to disrupt something that's going on that's not really allowing positivity to come into your life. So I really like that you're using that word in a very specific way. Um, so
Yeah.
the Institute does a lot of work across healthcare and, as you're mentioning, education and economic mobility. Um, what do you think education leaders can learn from how other sectors are using innovation to create more sort of human-centered systems?
Yeah, I love the question. And I think a lot of times, let me start with the contrast, right? Which is, a lot of times when people say, oh, the use of technology in schools, that could be dangerous, right? And sort of the framing is, oh, are you replacing teachers? Or are you going to create a cell phone rich environment where kids are distracted and doing all sorts of things that perhaps they shouldn't be doing on social media? And my answer to those questions is actually, the use of technology should be to accentuate what makes us human, right? And I think what we see consistently, and I'll start with education, but then I'll talk about other areas, a lecture is not particularly human, right? Beaming out words at 30 plus students, is not particularly a great way to connect with other humans. But if I can use technology to deliver, say, the knowledge part of it,
Mm-hmm.
and then as a teacher, I can be facilitating a conversation with 3, 4, 5 kids where they're getting lots of turns to talk and exchange ideas and collaborate and so forth. Now that becomes a really human interaction. It allows me as a teacher, I would argue, to practice at the top of my craft, right? I can really dial into, gee, why is Michael struggling today? He didn't get food. Okay, what do we do about that? And really the things that are uniquely human about us, and let technology do the things that technology does well. And I think we see that in healthcare, for example, and it's something that people can think about. Personalized medicine obviously has become a very big deal, precision medicine, things of that nature. And the way we think about it, if you've gone to, say, get a strep throat diagnosed at a Minute Clinic, for example, at a CVS or a Walmart or something like that, now nurse practitioners can do the things we formerly had to let doctors do. And so in many ways, through the power of technology diagnostics, we've allowed human beings to practice to the top of their craft. And that's always the question, right? Now specialists and doctors, they can focus on those really tricky issues that require all their intuition and training and connection and so forth, and let technology handle, again, those things that it's really good at, to free us up to sort of practice at the top of our crafts. I think that's consistently true. In the global prosperity place, the question we always say is, how do you use new technologies to create new markets that are locally based, right? Where you can have entrepreneurs on the ground creating jobs for people on the ground, and really markets that are right-sized, if you will, to the environment in which they're operating, as opposed to, a large multinational selling its stuff in. That's fine. Consumption is important, but the way you really create prosperity is by allowing those local jobs to amount. And the way you do that is by creating markets on the ground where people can do meaningful work.
Yeah, it's funny. Not funny, but you're talking about this, and I'm thinking about the word personalization, which you talk a lot in your book, Blended. You're talking a lot about prosperity and local communities, and I think that's really contingent on the amount of personalization that you can allow within that structure. And you talk a lot about that in your book, Blended, which I want to kind of segue into, which is about how schools can use blended learning, the integration of online learning with traditional classroom methods to sort of personalize education and improve outcomes. And, one key factor I loved was that technology isn't the point, but personalization is.
Yeah.
And, when used well and cohesively, blended learning can make education more equitable, engaging, emotionally supportive, but I really love this integration of, it's not that it shouldn't be there. It's the marriage of technology and personalization, which is, I think, really crucial. And you said before that blended learning, isn't about the tech. Can you, in your own words, sort of unpack that for us? What does successful personalization look like in practice within education, and maybe outside of education too?
Yeah. Well, first, let me just say, I love the way you framed that, because to me, blended learning is a thing that we do so that we can personalize. And why do we want to personalize? That is so that we can unlock potential in each and every kid, because we know we don't learn at the same pace. We know we don't all have the same background knowledge to access a topic, right? You explain an analogy to you through one set of concepts. To me, I don't have much familiarity with me. It sort of bores me out. I tune out. And you can use a whole, sports analogies or whatever to lock me into something. And so this notion that we need to personalize, it's well understood, I would say, in the literature. But where we get gummed up, I think, sometimes is we think personalization is the end goal. Whereas that in itself is also a means to an end, which is self-actualized humans, right? Able to operate at the height of their potential, develop passions, right? Figure out, how can I contribute to the world, and things like that. And so that's sort of the point of it, is what I would say. What's interesting, just if we step back, I would argue like a Montessori classroom. Maria Montessori created that, right, over 100 years ago at this point. They've been using technology to personalize all those decades. It's just not digital technology, right? It's manipulatives, things like that allow the child to practice and learn at the level that's right for them. And there's this self-correcting feature, and they move on when they can demonstrate mastery. And the teacher's job in that environment is to really assess and observe the child, to be coaxing and prodding and supporting them right on their journey. In many ways, I think, digital technology, it's no different, right? We're using it in the same way when it's used well, to be able to unlock that and really think about mastery as the objective of whatever you're working on at that moment. The reason I say that is, like, look, I can imagine personalization to an extreme can be a bad thing, right? It could mean that we are totally fractured and individualized and not having conversations, right, across difference, right, in our society. Or it could mean perhaps that, someone decides, I want to study underwater basket weaving. It's a perfectly noble pursuit, but probably not super useful in today's day and age, right? And so personalization toward what? Well, how can I contribute to my community, society as an individual, I think is a key frame on that as well. And frankly, that's like how you'd think about it in healthcare too, which is to say, you know, on average, you have X disease, therefore you should do this. Well, not all of us conform to the average. So, you know, given our lifestyle, given our particular DNA, our epigenetics, and so forth, how do we get the right course of action, treatment, and so forth for you? I think is a really important set of things to be thinking about. And, you know, it turns out like dyslexia in education, it's really an umbrella thing that we use to describe someone who struggles to read as their IQ would have predicted, right? Relative to their IQ. But the reality is like it's masking lots of different variation of why someone is struggling to read. And it's sort of this blanket thing we've assigned to a common set of symptoms. I think the same thing is true in healthcare, right? If you look at certain cancers, for example, or even certain kinds of diabetes and so forth, like those are blanket terms we are using to describe what are actually very distinct molecular pathways and lifestyles and so forth. And so how can we break that down to get the right thing for you, as opposed to saying, hey, we're just assuming you're a widget. On average, this is what happens. 60% of the time it works. Sorry if you're in the 40%, too bad. That's the world we're trying to escape.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's really well put. So, you know, you're talking about basically not layering on tech and a blanket sort of panacea for something that's so individualistic. How do you get structures that are so seems to be like set in stone help break away from that habit? You know,
Yeah.
breaking a habit is tough, even individual, like even just like I'm not going to drink coffee anymore, you know. But how do you really help these institutions sort of sway away from these habits?
Yeah, it's the exact right question. And I think it has been the hardest part of the work, to be honest with you, in the 20 years that I've been at it. Because it's like grooves on a factory floor. Schools are it's very difficult to break out of. And so what I think we have seen, unfortunately, is a lot of folks interpreted our book Disrupting Class to be like layer technology over the traditional classroom, and we have not gotten the benefits
Right.
that we had hoped for or described were possible in that or blended, when we wrote those. And so I think that's been unfortunate because they haven't had the perspective you just did, which is like, you actually have to think about the models and the processes and like undoing those and then using tech in that new model as opposed to just layering it over. I'll say, how do you get out of it? Twofold. One, I think the schools that have done the best job of getting out of it, they've created whole new models outside of the traditional sort of subject matter or areas where they're working or an after school or things like that to really experiment, prototype, get some experience with like, what's the right model for the population, the teachers we have, like how we're going to work with kids. And then they start to very intentionally move traditional classrooms into these new models of learning in a way that's not threatening. It starts with a coalition of willing, it shows success, and it starts to pull people in over time. But they're very deliberate about it. Like the learning model becomes the non-negotiable,
Right.
and they sort of like a lot of change management, if you will, through it. I think the second way we're seeing it right now across the country is a lot of educators coming out of the pandemic in particular got very fed up with a very one size fits all bureaucratic response and have been starting their own micro schools and new schools completely that are unencumbered by the traditional system, saying like, hey, we can actually do a lot of this if we create it from scratch. And so that's the other place where across the country right now, you see a lot of personalization and novel uses of technology to really enable that for a lot of populations. And at the moment, it seems like that's the way that has the path of least resistance, if you will, right? Because it's educators making the choice to opt out of something, create something new. They're not encumbered by the old structures. And then parents and families are opting in as opposed to sort of forcing them to do something that they're not sure about.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really this willingness to change and this desire to change and this commitment to change. I think that's really important as well. You also mentioned these models that you have. You lay out these different models and blended, like station rotation, flex, and a la carte. Can you explain just a little, just what that is and which of these models you think have seen really hold up well post-pandemic and within institutions, like, or educational institutions?
Yeah, I love the question. I'll try to go quickly through it. The one that I think is the most well-known among people is the flipped classroom, right? Where we say, okay, we're going to use technology to deliver the content outside of the classroom, and then that's the homework now. And when you come to class, we're going to do projects and discussions and really apply these things. I think of flipped classroom as almost sort of the gateway drug to these other models. It's not necessarily revolutionary, but it sort of gets the teacher experience with using technology to personalize and create a more active learning environment. The station rotation, I think of as like a lot of elementary schools. They have centers-based learning already. Students rotate, right, among different centers. One of those can now be technology. It can be a station where you're doing Lexia learning or Dreambox learning, Zern, whatever, learning some math, reading, whatever it is. And then ideally, the teacher is taking that data of like, hey, how's Michael doing today on his learning? And can resort me, right, to really make sure I'm getting the supports and scaffolds in the other centers that I need. I would say the flex model that you referenced is the one that has maybe not been used that often within districts, but is taking off big time in these micro schools. And my co-author, Heather Staker in Blended, she's basically decided like, that's the way of the future. That's the way we got to go. We really have to push this way because it is really the most personalization and opportunities for projects and fluidity of any of the models that is sort of unencumbered, if you will, by the old time-based schedule. And so flex is what it sounds like. I get to move flexibly and fluidly through whatever modalities make sense for me when it's when it makes sense to do it.
Yeah. Thinking about all this, for a K through 12 educator, how do you support their effort individually? You're trying to have these educators support their students individually, but how do you support the educator, the teacher who's in there and is like, okay, I obviously want to make this transition so it's not just sort of a one size fits all sort of thing, but how do you support them individually so they're capable of doing this?
Yeah, it's a great question. We did research around why did teachers change their practice pretty dramatically, and there were sort of 4 use cases or jobs to be done. The first one was basically, I want to be a leader in my school. Like, I want to be part of a change movement. And so for that individual, it's less about the model and more, how do you get them on the front lines of learning how to do this and like all the enthusiasm and energy of bringing something to the school. And the supports there are more external, right? Because they're going to learn from other schools that have made this transition, other places that they can go, and they're bringing it back actually to other teachers. The second group was what we call they're like, basically, my kids are disengaged. I want something that brings them back, into the classroom, brings them back and so forth. And these teachers, they were not looking for like the dramatic transformation. These folks were not interested in a flex model or fully mastery based, every kid moving at their own pace. They were like, how do I use technology in bite-sized ways to really re-engage, motivate learners? And what I would say is they're, administrators, consultants, whoever it is, or frankly, you're the ed tech company coming in, you can't just give your technology. You actually have to show how you use it and help them set up the classroom so that they are set up for success. If you're going to go to a station rotation, that's almost the easiest way to do it. And showing them, okay, one of these centers, like this is how we're going to break up your day. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. We're not going to leave it to chance. These are your blocks. These kids are going to go to the online learning station here, and really coaching them through in a prescriptive way Once they see it, then they can start to play out of the sandbox and sort of paint with it. But you really have to help them make that transition in very deliberate ways. And then the third group was a group that basically said, I'm on the verge of quitting because I've decided this model is so bankrupt that I just do not believe in it. I want to overthrow everything and make the big radical jump. And for them, I think you really have to start with, okay, like, let's get specific about what sucks about the current model. It's seat time based, right? Kids don't move on when they master. They move on because of a clock that says today is, May, whatever, and therefore you have to do this. Like, let's get super specific about this so that you understand the why. Let's overthrow that. And then again, really support them in building structures, because there's going to be more chaos in those models. And they have to understand, the kid who is in fourth grade and is ready to do algebra. Like, what do you do with that kid? Right. And then on the other side of it, you got the kid who's still working on number sense and so forth. Like, how do you deal with that? We have to make sure you have all the tools at your disposal as that teacher. So you don't have to make it up on the fly, right? You really have those supports. And then the last group, frankly, was like people who were sort of compliance oriented. They were going along to get along. And what I would tell you is I would actually stop pushing those teachers to make the switch because their heart is not in it.
Right.
I would say let them do what they're doing. And if their colleagues are really successful in these new models, if other parents and kids and teachers are talking about it, let them get excited and want to move there and become part of the coalition of the willing, as opposed to force them. Because at least in my experience, if you force a teacher to do something they're not excited about, it's not going to get done well and it's not worth it.
Right. Yeah. Excitement is the key factor. As you're talking about, individualism, the student and everything, I'm thinking about, a few friends of mine who were catapulted, or they had to be in classes that were not really for them. So they were a little behind, but they were in classes that were more advanced than they were. And it kind of catapulted them into being, it's kind of like you mirror your surroundings.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? So instead of looking at things in an individual way, like this kid is maybe a little more behind than Bob,
Yeah.
But since they're around these other kids who are a bit more advanced, it might usher them into a more advanced sort of like state of mind. How do you factor the positives of that with the individualism of what you're trying to do?
Yeah, I think there's some great research that just came out actually about this literally in the last few days that we're recording this from TNTP and New Classrooms that showed that, look, you don't want to slide away from sort of what I would describe as minimal expectations, but ideally high expectations for students. And then so the kid, say in algebra, right, who actually is missing some pretty basic building blocks of mathematics, you still show them the algebraic concepts, but then the work that they have to do is actually filling in the holes with the personalization so that they can level up and be with their peers, right? And so you're not going to make them overly frustrated. We know if you're so far behind and a goal seems so unattainable, the human reaction is to be like, not for me, can't do it, and zero out. But you're giving them the scaffolds to go ahead and get to that high goal that you're describing so that it is attainable. I think the ultimate in this, frankly, is that ultimately we're building learners who can do what your friends just did, right? Which is to take ownership of their learning and be like, yeah, this is a stretch goal, but I know how to catch up and do this because I've learned how to support myself and be a lifelong learner, which in the bigger picture is what's going to be required of all of us. I mean, we see AI and technology changing how we work so rapidly that you and I can be doing this conversation remotely and like we don't need a producer to do it is incredible. But that means like the importance of constantly learning, either formally or informally, is going to be baked into our existence as we leave formal schooling. And so I think actually building that muscle in all kids is an incredibly important thing, so that at first it's heavily scaffolded to go for that thing that seemed high or unattainable. But then over time, they're like, oh, I know how to do that, to go, chase that kid there. Or, wow, that topic looked cool that my friend was doing. I want to go get that too. And I know actually how to help find and build a program for me so I can go do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess delivering it in sort of bite-sized, manageable ways for the kids. I kind of want to segue into Disrupting Class. You co-authored this book with Clayton Christensen. It was first published in 2008, which is nearly 2 decades ago, and you're still talking about it. And the core message is kind of what we were talking about, but if we want real transformation, we need to sort of reimagine the system and not just improve it, which requires what we're talking about now, personalization and flexibility and digital tools. If you were writing a 2025 edition, what would be the chapter you'd rewrite, or how would you edit things in a way that sort of reimagines it for 2025?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, AI obviously would play a big role in it. And I think the use of AI along a few dimensions. One, obviously to like rapidly create content to personalize for different kids would be pretty exciting. And I think we would have done it with a better understanding of like learning design and cognitive science principles than we had when we wrote Disrupting Class, frankly. You can't just like use ChatGPT to build a great curriculum for kids. You actually have to understand how learning works and train things off of that. So I think that's one thing I would think about. I think a second thing is probably hammering home even harder the change management pieces of this, and that it's not just about I thought we were clear. It's not just about layering over, but based on what I've seen over the last 20 years, I think we were perhaps not clear enough. And I think the third thing would be, it's largely what, I did in From Reopen to Reinvent when I wrote that, and it was published in 2022, I guess, which was to acknowledge the learning of academic knowledge, but in this bigger ecosystem of habits of success and sort of these, some people call them social emotional learning, some people call it non-cog skills, like whatever your turn of phrase is, how those contribute and reinforce each other, I think would be something I would think a lot about. And then frankly, like this world of education savings accounts and micro schools, I've referenced them a few times, but like, I think that's where the entrepreneurial energy is right now around the innovation. So how would we harness that to really make sure we're creating opportunities for kids to learn in different communities, but knit together a better dialogue that contributes, I think would be the other one. And then the last piece, I think work-based learning is going to be so important in the future. And what I mean by that is really experiential opportunities for kids. The world is changing so fast. We can't codify that in a textbook. We've got to have kids really out getting their hands dirty, I think, in real meaningful projects. Whether that's through employees or employers or community organizations or civic problems that we're trying to solve, whatever it is, empowering kids, I think, to have more agency and to get their hands dirty on those things, I think are incredibly important.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially since technology has like ushered us into our little rooms. I don't think we needed it in the system as much when technology wasn't at its height. It's just kind of, we naturally sort of were community based and wanted to be involved. And now it's kind of, we have to rewrite the system to sort of adapt to older times, which is kind of a weird cyclical thing.
Yeah.
But so in hindsight, do you think, the pace of education has been slower? I mean, I know it's been faster, but what's been that sort of biggest barrier for the sort of progression of education, whether it be mindset, policy, funding, something else? Like, what has been that biggest barrier, and how do you want to see education transform in the next 5-10 years?
Yeah. I thought a lot about this because in some ways I think we got it exactly right in Disrupting Class. In some ways I think we got it exactly wrong. And so what I think we got right is like, yes, the analog to digital transformation has occurred, right? Like to your point, most kids now have an online learning component of their day and so forth. What we got completely wrong was we thought public schools would very naturally be able to start personalizing and sort of throwing off the traditional monolithic system. And I think, gosh, those processes you alluded to at the beginning have been so much stickier. The funding mechanisms, right, in schools that we fund seat time, not learning, has been so much stickier. That we sort of assume because of your age that you must be learning this standard on this day has been so much stickier than I think we had realized when we got into this. And so I think things that really break out of those models and do it apart have really increased in my own my own understanding. So then they're not beholden by those old processes and sort of assumptions, if you will. Because I think we sort of automated in some way or digitized, if you will, like the traditional system, but that's like not what we really meant to do. I see it right now. This another live conversation right now is phones in schools, and all these states are passing laws to ban them. And I think for good reasons, in the sense that social media has had a very detrimental impact, I think, on a lot of kids' mental health. It has had a lot of, downsides, right? I know in our family, like, we believe strongly in the wait until eighth pledge for getting our girls smartphones and things like that. And even that feels like young at the moment. And at the same time, I know that purposely used, technology can create opportunities for huge engagement, right? So like, you imagine the science class that goes out to the pond and is collecting samples, and like they use their mobile phone to take a picture with Google Lens to understand what something is. And like, right, like all of a sudden that unlocks what? And so
Right.
I get very nervous about these sort of top-down policy mandates around how things should work. And I would love to see a lot more opportunities for like, hey, this is what we want kids to know and be able to do, but let's empower educators and the communities to figure out the right way to do it for them. Like my own class that I teach at Harvard at the ed school, I don't allow technology when we're having a discussion, but at very key points during the class now, I say, everyone take out your phones or laptops. We're going to do a quick check for understanding to see where everyone is, right? And so like, that's very clear usage of technology at dedicated points in time. I think that's helped make me a better teacher. I think it's helped them be better learners because it's clearer, right? Oh, okay, I was missing that in the discussion before. This is what he meant by that. And so just being much more intentional, but I don't think that can be a policy mandate, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of like, I think of the word tact. Having tact is such a graceful art form, and having artificial intelligence tact, artificial intention, AI,
Yep.
is something I think that needs to sort of be intentionalized. I don't even know if that's a word.
No, but we'll make it one now, because I think the intention is the big part of it. And too often we're sort of defaulting into something without like, okay, what's the purpose here? And asking that question, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the same thing, with this is going to sound silly, but the Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is really powerful. Artificial intelligence is super powerful, and you have to use it with intent. And it's the same thing, when you're thinking about, fame and celebrities, and, with a lot of power, you have a lot of responsibility. And it's crazy to think how each individual has needs, with your relationship with technology. You have a lot of, especially as an educator, even more so, you have more responsibility to understand the tenets of just artificial intelligence tactness,
Totally agree. I mean, it's interesting, right? My 10-year-olds, they'll pop on ChatGPT to, sort of debate through a question now. And then I'll catch them like creating a game with ChatGPT and sort of going down the doom loop. And I'm like, okay, I'm the adult. I got to step in here, right? Not because I blame you, but
Right.
because like I have to help educate you. Like, hey, this is the trap. Super useful for this, and now you can get in this doom spiral around this. And so that understanding and educating, I think, with intention, I love that you put it there, I think is really important.
Right. And, it's just, especially for young kids, it's like their synapses are just forming. And so when they see the computer and when they see Chat GPT, all of a sudden it's like dopamine,
Yeah,
and you
totally.
like make sure that they're also getting these dopamine hits when they're like outside touching grass too, to
100%,
make sure
100%, right?
shots
Like yeah. So we were, so I'm on the board of a group that actually is helping do self-directed learning to build literacy and numeracy in Africa. It's called Imagine Worldwide. So we were just there in Tanzania for our board meeting. I brought my kids to it so that they could go to 3 schools while we were out there and see it. But the last couple of days we were out on the beach in Zanzibar, and they were hiking along in these tide pools, and they learned from the guides how to pick up sea urchins safely, right, and so forth. And it was Mother's Day. And so they learned, right, with talking with the guides, but then checking with ChatGPT, what is a safe urchin, sea urchin to eat? And so they collected literally 5 of them and surprised my wife, so that the kitchen prepared like uni basically on the spot that they had caught right from the water. And I was like, what a cool marriage
right.
of
Yeah.
like experience being out there. I was just on a chair watching them, 200, 300 yards out. They're just doing this, but then they learn what's safe. They can check themselves and like, boom, present it. It was so cool to see that magic come together. I would hate that technology would rob us of those experiences, but I would equally hate we sort of zeroed out technology that you didn't get access to the full set of opportunities in nature.
Yeah. Talk about capital B blended right
Yeah,
there.
yeah,
It's just like
yeah,
that can be the image of your new blended two, your kids out there collecting sea life. That's really cool.
yeah.
Um, so our last question: across your work, whether in writing, research, leadership, you've consistently challenged systems to work better for people. I think this kind of ties into what we're talking to right now. What's one personal value that has anchored you through all of your work and everything that you do?
Wow. That is a great question. I think the one I'll say is humility, and humility that I could be wrong, that my prescriptions that work for one set of kids could be wrong for another set of kids, that my ideas, like I'm constantly learning from others, and it's exciting when you're wrong and you get to learn, that you see an anomaly that you couldn't explain and you get to learn. And so I think humility would be the thing that has constantly guided me. When I led the Christensen Institute's education team, and we would testify in states and so forth, I used to tell the team, half of our job is to say, like, let's not do that policy, as opposed to like guns blazing, mandate blended learning for every kid or something like that. Because we should have humility that we don't know exactly what each kid on the ground needs for them, and we instead create the conditions that individuals on the ground can craft the right thing for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Humility is something that needs to be more ubiquitous. So, and just it's funny because someone who's dedicated to growth and to change, being quote unquote wrong feels like growth after a while.
Yeah.
It feels like, okay, there's something that I can learn from and grow from and adapt from and get better and stronger from, and that's a really good feeling to have, so.
And it's an awesome thing to model too, because as an adult, when you show that you're learning still and you're trying something new, what a
Right.
cool thing to show your kids,
Yeah.
right? It's just, I think it's really cool to have that kind of humility.
Yeah, I agree. And on that, I really appreciate you being here today on the Civil Talk podcast, and for really giving us your super informative and thoughtful and smart, intentional insight on everything that you do. Really appreciate it.
Well, you're very kind, but thank you for having me and for facilitating the dialogue. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah, and for our listeners, if you want to explore more of Michael's work, please check out his books, Disrupting Class, Blended, and Choosing College, which we will all have linked on our site. He also hosts the Future of Education podcast, which is packed with smart conversations around what's next for learning. There's actually so much on his podcast. I really recommend listening to it. We highly recommend tuning into that. That'll be linked on our site as well. And as always, if this episode resonated with you, like, subscribe, share, all that fun stuff. Thanks for tuning in. And until next time, stay curious and stay kind.